Let's bring you some more analysis now. Live from Sydney, Clare Armstrong joins us. She's the national political editor at the Daily Telegraph, Herald Sun, Adelaide Advertiser and Courier Mail. Clare, good to see you. Thanks for your time. I understand that you've spent the past fortnight following both the yes and the no campaigns around the country, from Hobart to North Queensland. What insights did you get out of that? Did you notice a big shift in attitudes depending on where you were? Were there some consistent themes that kept popping up as you spoke with Australians about their stance?
Yeah, there were some really interesting themes. I spent time, particularly I noticed in North Queensland, quite a divide between predominantly Indigenous communities. I went to some remote communities like Mossman Gorge and Yarrabah. There was a lot of support for the voice there, but also at this point in the campaign, quite a lot of anxiety about how the campaign has run and concern about what the future of Indigenous affairs in Australia is. Whereas contrasting into some of the more battleground states like South Australia and Tasmania, it was more a push from voters to want to do the right thing. They wanted to know answers. They had concerns, or some didn't have concerns but were worried that maybe people in their community hadn't been reached as effectively as they could have been by the campaign. So quite a mixed bag, but generally I found voters were just starting to really engage with this issue in the last week even.
Clare, on voting day, over the years on elections, we usually see a bit of expectation management going off on both sides of any sort of vote. Have we seen that this time around? What are the no and the yes campaigns saying to journalists today ahead of the vote count happening this evening about where they think they're at?
Absolutely. Well, we've heard from the No campaign this morning, that they're sort of quietly confident that the referendum will be defeated, but there's been a big kind of last minute push from them, particularly around voter turnout. They're concerned that might have an impact on the result. But actually, we haven't seen so much publicly and even privately that much from the Yes campaign in terms of expectation management. I think because unlike an election where gets to a point where political parties want to start to save the furniture, this is really an all or nothing for the Yes campaign. They campaign till 6 o'clock and try and get as many votes as possible because there's no coming back in 3 years' time necessarily. There's no obvious next step for them. So even privately, they're sort of saying, look, they'd be pretty happy if they got anywhere close to a national majority. I think, the best case scenario for Yes, at least based off the last few polls, would have to be maybe 3 states and 45% nationally. But the worst case could be no states and maybe a national vote that starts with a 3.
And so, Clare, what would that sort of result mean for the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese? We know he's been heavily involved in campaigning around the country. What does it do for him in terms of his political capital?
Well, it was interesting that we saw in the news poll result this morning that the Prime Minister's disapproval rating hadn't shifted, whereas opposition leader Peter Dutton's had. So it remains a little unclear how much Australians will personally blame Mr Albanese and tie this result to his leadership. However, I think it is very telling that the Prime Minister has decided to finish up this referendum campaign back in Canberra. He won't be out with corflutes in the background, either commiserating or celebrating. I think he's made a very conscious decision to go back to the nation's capital, to have this kind of statesman-like approach to whatever happens, because we know that, it's most likely going to be a no by the end of tonight. But even if it's a yes, it will be so narrow that the Prime Minister's focus has to be so much on uniting the country going forward.
And Clare, for everybody who's getting ready to tune in and watch our coverage here on Sky News, what are you expecting in terms of just how fast we might see a result?
Well, you know what, honestly, it's not like a usual referendum where you have to counter in things like preferences. It's a pretty straightforward yes, no count. It would be extraordinary, I think, if we had to wait beyond tonight for postals and interstate votes. I suspect we'll have a very clear answer by 9 o'clock. That would be my expectation, possibly earlier.
Clare Armstrong, we are gearing up for a big night of coverage here on Sky News, and we really appreciate your contribution for us today. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.